Good morning. It is wonderful to see everyone this morning. I'm glad we did not melt walking over here, so I think we will survive the day in this nice shaded environment. We are, believe it or not talking about Revelation this morning. We have concluded that study. I know it took a while to get through, but I hope that we have a better general idea of that book. It's a very confusing book, but it is also a very, very relevant book for us. We're going to be moving on to a popular request since Revelation. Many of y'all asked if we could study Daniel after Revelation, since we have had so many references to Daniel and kind of aspects of the background that are reflected in Revelation from Daniel. So we kind of wanted to look at Daniel and not only make those connections, but kind of see it in its own right, especially as it's kind of the first book of its kind, if you will, that we see in Scripture. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Now I can hear myself. Okay. Do I need to rewind all that? So we are going to start in on Daniel, and I was trying to figure out what the best way would be to go about that. We're not, at least for the first part of the book, going to approach it the same way as Revelation, because it's not written the same way as Revelation, at least not the first part of the book. So I think the best thing that's going to serve us well as we approach this book is a more big picture approach, rather than, I think that kind of the normal thing is to, okay, well, who wrote the book? What's the author? What's the date? All these kind of things. We're not quite going to go that direction, although we'll touch on some of those things. But I want us to just focus for this morning anyway, as we begin looking at the book of Daniel, on a very simple question. What comes to mind when you think of Daniel? What is Daniel about? I'll give you a hint. One of the things people usually think of is right there on the screen, right? What comes to mind when you think of Daniel? All right, Daniel in the lion's den. That's the most common one, right? Let's go on from there. What else? What else comes to mind when you think of the book of Daniel?
Visions.
Do what?
Visions.
Okay, there's a lot of visions. Maybe the chapter 2, that statue, that's one of them. Good. What else? Okay, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Somebody else said something?
Fighting the giant.
Do what? Fighting the giant? That's David. But no, you're okay. You're okay. So we got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the lion's den, the vision. What else? Yep, good. That's what Lister said. Obedience. Okay, good. We'll come back to that for sure. What else? Do what? Okay, good. Just generally the discussion of Nebuchadnezzar and all those kinds of things. Very good. Okay, so when we think about the book of Daniel, a lot of these stories come to mind. We might also throw in the writing on the wall, right? Remember, there's this feast, and a hand all of a sudden appears and writes on the wall. We might think about Daniel chapter 1, which we'll talk about next week, Lord willing, where you have them not eating the king's food, not defiling themselves with the king's food. We've heard all of these stories, okay? But the point we want to get to is that these stories are not all there is to Daniel. Now, we're going to certainly talk about these stories, and these stories are not just there to be there, but we've heard all this, right? This, in fact, if you notice, these pictures are pulled from like Bible class curriculum for kids. This is some of the go-to stuff for kids, right? Guess where all of these stories, and as always, I'm using story in the sense of how it's told. It is a true story, but it's a story nonetheless. What do all these stories have in common? Where are they found in Daniel? Anybody know? What part of Daniel are they found in?
Begin 4 years after the movement from Israel to Babylon.
Okay, good. They all start there, but I'm talking about in the book itself. What part of the book of Daniel are all these stories found in? They're all in the first half. Anybody Anybody know anything that comes from the second half of Daniel? Somebody throw out something that comes from the second half of Daniel.
Most of that deals with prophecy.
Okay, good. Do you know any of the specific prophecies?
The king is coming.
Okay, good. General message of like a king coming and things like that. But we really don't talk about any of the stuff, generally speaking, that comes from that second half. Now, I say all that to say this. There's a reason why we talk about those stories that are in the first half of Daniel. Why do we talk about Daniel in the lion's den? Or the writing on the wall? Or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Why do we spend so much time, especially with kids and Bible classes and things like that, but even in adult classes and sermons and stuff, why do we spend so much time talking about the stories that are in the first half of Daniel?
They're uplifting, they're enlightening, faith. Stick to your guns.
Okay, good. All of that is absolutely true. They're uplifting, they're enlightening, they're encouraging, all these things. Stick to your faith. What else stands out about all those things? How hard is it to understand bow down to idols? No, I'll throw you in a furnace. Still no. Oh, God saved me. Is that hard to understand? They're simple, right? The first half of Daniel, overall, the basic storyline of each story, and by the way, each story is kind of divided up. There's basically 6 separate stories that all kind of stand alone very nicely. They're simple. They're easy to understand. Have you ever cracked open the latter half of Daniel? It is not easy to understand. So unlike Revelation, where pretty much the whole book, you're like scratching your head, maybe with the exception of the letters, but even those have some confusing things in them. You kind of scratching your head throughout the whole book of Revelation. You're like, okay. And so a lot of people just kind of avoid Revelation. I mean, I'm just being honest. There's a lot of people that just really don't want to go there because they don't understand it. Daniel, they don't take that approach to the first part of the book. Most people, they are all about the first part of the book because it's understandable, it's easy, it's approachable. But man, most people just kind of ignore that the second half exists. Why? Well, if things are hard to understand like that and we don't feel like we understand them, let's just stick with what we know. But when it comes to how the book is structured, there's a reason for it. So let's ask this question. What does it mean to set the stage? Where does that phrase come from? Anybody know?
My rabbi says it's a story.
Do what?
My rabbi says it's the story.
Okay, there's the idea of a...
Set the stage.
Okay, there's the story, but what is it? Where does that phrase come from? Is that too obvious? Right. If Sherry were here, Keith, right, she would be all over this. Setting the stage comes from a theatrical production where you have literally the person in charge of building the props and the backgrounds and all those kind of things for the stage to set up the stage for the story. Now, if you've ever seen a play or something like that, or I mean, they do this in movies too, but it's a little more obvious in a sense in plays. Whenever you have the curtain opening, and you see the background, before the actors even walk onto the stage, I almost fell off the stage saying that. What does the stage itself do for the play?
Sets the scene.
What do you mean by that?
Well,
You're right,
you
but
just kind of know it's going to be something recorded what's on the stage.
okay.
Well, the scenery, the lighting,
Yeah.
Okay, good.
gives you an image of what's coming up.
Okay, good. We went and saw The Lion King, the Broadway version of The Lion King. Beautiful, beautiful show, by the way, if y'all ever get a chance to see it. But we went and saw that, I think it was in Oklahoma City where we went. And the curtain opens, right? And you have that scene, if you've seen the movie as well, you have that scene, you have kind of an African sunrise, like the scenery with the tree and Pride Rock and all these things. And just you get the sense already going off the top that you're in an African kind of safari setting or whatever, and then the music starts and you know where you are, right? You're kind of grounded even before the story begins. You're kind of grounded in what's happening. Or one time, this has been a different scenario, this one in Tennessee, went and saw the play Newsies. And automatically the stage opens and you have, all these and what would it be, 19th century New York's building, like apartment buildings and the railing and all the laundry strung out between, the stereotypical New York kind of scene. So we know where we are. It sets the stage. So now, moving forward, we don't know anything really about the story itself yet. We don't know anything about the plot, but we kind of have our bearings of where we are, where we're starting off, what is about to happen, the surroundings that are going to involve that. That's what the first half of Daniel is doing for us. Now, don't get me wrong, going back to what Ralph said, the stories in and of themselves are absolutely, even as standalones, meant to be encouraging, meant to inspire faith, meant to do all these things. But they are also meant to set the stage, to give us our bearings for the book as a whole, and especially the second half. So, interestingly enough, part of what's actually happening when we focus only on the beginning, it's as if we open the curtains and all the stage is beautifully set. We're like, oh wow, what's the story going to be? And then we just stop, right? The book is written for a reason the way it is written. It's meant to help us understand things moving forward. So let's think about all these stories. Let's go back to the stories that we're familiar with in this first half of Daniel. We've got the people coming, the young men coming to Babylon, and they're offered all these foods, and they refuse to eat of the king's food. You have the dream that's given, and all these others are relying on these other gods, and Daniel says only the Lord God can interpret this dream, and he interprets this dream about God being in control of all the nations. You have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, bow down to this idol. No, well, I'll throw you in the fire. Still no. Oh, well, you're saved. Okay. You have the writing on the wall. You have Daniel in the lion's den. All these things. What do all these stories have in common? Because if we find the theme, we're going to understand what the purpose of these stories is to set the stage. So, just knowing what you already know, because we're familiar with these stories, what do these stories have in common? Faithfulness. Okay, good. Let's expound on that. What else?
All-powerful being prophesies ahead of time. It's going to stick with you. You can interpret future things.
Okay. You have especially in chapter 2, you have this aspect of God being the only one who can foretell the future. Good. What else? What do all these stories have in common? What's the common theme here?
God's sovereignty.
Okay, good. God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty when what? What is the setting for all these stories?
Kind of a similar situation of absolute dividing, like here, the suppression.
Okay, good. We have sovereignty combined with what appears to be everything out of control. Are Daniel, Hananiah, Azrael, whatever you say his name, and I thought I knew them all. Hananiah, yeah. Anyway, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are their Babylonian names. We'll get to that later. Were those 4 individuals born and raised in Babylon? They're Jews, right? So they're not home. They're not home against their will. And they're being asked to do things like eat of the king's food, worship the king's idol, pray only to the king. How much control does it appear that they have in any of those situations? None, right? Completely powerless. And yet, who every single time is proved to be sovereign? God. So we have this idea of oppression, faithfulness, as Ray said, throughout that oppression. We have the idea of a sovereign God who can do things like see the future and so forth. And therefore, we combine all of those things, and what do we have? Well, let's kind of think about the background a little bit. We've looked at this in detail not too long ago, so I'll just kind of do a refresher here. Daniel and the individuals who are with him, again, I'm just going to call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so we never call them by the other names, and they just slipped my mind. But Israel, the northern kingdom, and at this point, the southern kingdom as well, they are captives now. Now, it's important to note, Israel, and I should say Jerusalem, has not been fully destroyed when Daniel and his friends first are taken to Babylon. There is this first battle where essentially Jerusalem is defeated and captives are taken, but the whole place isn't just utterly destroyed yet. That comes a couple of years later. But that first wave is when Daniel and his friends are taken to Babylon. So even though the destruction of Jerusalem hasn't happened in chapter 1, it probably happens around chapter 2, chapter 3, right? So it's still there. That was the beginning of the end, if you will, for Judah, for Jerusalem. So they've been defeated. A lot of them have been enslaved. We talked at length about that a few weeks ago on Sunday night, about this, the Babylonian captivity that occurs here. That's the setting for Daniel. We're probably mostly familiar with that. But here's the thing, as we mentioned earlier. Now that they're captives in a foreign land, now they're facing a great deal of pressure to conform to idolatry. Now, that's funny, because what did they get taken into captivity for? Idolatry, right? They've just been taken captive by Babylon, and God allowed that because they have been idolatrous. They haven't been faithful to his covenant. But now, the same thing that got them in this trouble in the first place is, to some extent, even a stronger pressure for them in their current situation. Now, for a people who has been okay with idolatry, what do you think most of the captive Jews are going to do when faced with pressure to participate in idolatry? Why not? Right? We've been doing it already. Now, to be fair, there are many who recognize, especially because of the prophets, this is happening to us because of the idolatry. And so, therefore, you have some, like Daniel and those with him, who decide we're not going to conform. But ultimately, you have the same scenario of pressure. But let's think about it for just a moment. I don't know that we could go in a specific direction with this, so I'm going to be general. If we're here in Wellington, Texas, we are familiar with our surroundings. We are familiar with the people around us. We're familiar with the language. We're familiar with the culture. And we are pulled to do something we know we shouldn't do. Is it easier, because we're familiar with our surroundings, to know ways to deal with that? I would say so. Now let's say you were plucked out of Wellington, Texas. You were taken to, I don't know, Beijing, China. Just throw one out there. Don't speak the language. I don't know a single word. Well, no, I know one single word of Chinese. It's like thank you. It's like shishit or something like that. I don't know the language. I don't know any of the people. I'm not familiar with their religious practices. Well, we won't go into Chinese religious practices. There's a couple of things we could throw out there, but I'm not familiar with them. Let's just leave it at that. And I'm there against my will. How hard is it to resist anything that you would be asked to do in that situation? You don't have any friends to call on for help. You don't have any resources. You don't even half the time really understand the dynamics because you're just now learning the language. It's going to be a whole lot harder to resist when you're completely out of your element like that. Not to mention, you've already been in an environment where a lot of these things are kind of okay. So how much more powerful is it when a group of people, 4 people, say no. Despite how hard this is, despite all the disadvantages we have, despite all the excuses we can put out there for why we're just going to go along to get along, we're going to stick to our guns. I think somebody said that phrase a second ago. And we're going to refuse to conform and remain faithful to our God. That's powerful. Now, we have this theme that we've kind of refined. The stories of Daniel. They're stories of a hero, and we can say heroes because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as well, but it still centers on Daniel. If you remember, and again, we'll get to this next week, in Daniel chapter 1, whenever they refuse to eat the food, Daniel's the ringleader, if you will. The others go along with him, but Daniel's the one that stayed as kind of taking the lead in that. So although the others are still to be commended, Daniel is meant to kind of have the center stage, kind of have the limelight on him. So the stories of Daniel are stories of a hero who refused to conform. Now, not conform with anything. He actually did conform with things that weren't against God's law, meaning he learned the language of the Babylonians, he learned the customs, the things that weren't opposed to the law, but he refused to conform in any way that would violate God's law. That's the emphasis of the stories. Why would that stage, that background, that setting be necessary for a book? Or maybe let me reword the question. Who needs a book with this as the underlying theme?
Other people who are in the same situation.
Okay. We talked when we got toward the end of Revelation about how it is an amazingly relevant book for us as Christians today, because we also are in an ungodly environment that is pulling us to conform, and we have to decide, are we going to compromise or remain faithful? So it's relevant to us, it's powerful for us because we're in that same situation. Well, guess what? Daniel was written with people who are in this same situation in mind. And that means if the stories are setting the stage and are all about not conforming, guess what that tells us about the second half of the book? It's certainly prophecy, as Fred said a second ago, but if the scene has been set by the stories, as it is just based on the construction of the book, that means all these prophecies are geared towards, I think Ralph said, a foreshadowing or foretelling by God of the fact that you, meaning God's people, the people who are going to be reading Daniel, are about to find yourself in a similar situation. And so you also need to be prepared. When we get to particularly the, let's say, probably chapter 10, chapter 11, especially, and also chapter 12, I would say as well, but especially chapter 11, I would say, we're going to begin to see something very interesting. Anybody, this is a random one, but for y'all who are more visual and remember things visually, I'm not always that way. Anybody know where we've seen this picture before? Anybody know what this picture is a reference to? Artist rendition, of course, but. Close, do what? This is the beginning of the Maccabean revolt. This is Mattathias killing the guy who said sacrifice to Zeus that kicks off the rebellion against the Seleucids, and we have that whole thing that we talked about again on Sunday nights. If you look at Daniel chapter 11, and don't worry, we're going to look at it in detail, the entire prophecy that's given there is a detailed prophecy predicting the events leading up to and culminating in the Maccabean revolt, focused on the oppression of God's people and the attempt to keep God's people from following after the law. Now, I want to make a caveat here, so we're going to kind of rewind and go very briefly to what we said about author and date and stuff like that. There are people who argue because of this that Daniel was actually written at that time. Like, it's written right around the Maccabean revolt to encourage people to resist and all these kind of things. I don't buy that. I do think it's genuine prophecy that's given several centuries before these events. We could have that discussion later, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but the point is, God is using the events that happened in Babylon to also reinforce for future generations, this is going to happen in a different setting, of course, but again. And so you need to take heart from these stories in the past so that when these events do come again, you can be prepared to be faithful, just like Daniel and his friends were faithful in a hostile environment, in an ungodly society that was pressuring them to conform. Doesn't that sound like God? If he knows, and of course he does, that his people are going to be in a difficult situation, faced with difficult circumstances, and pulled to leave faithfulness to God, doesn't that sound like something God would say, I'm going to warn you ahead of time so you know this is what you're about to face, and so you can strengthen your resolve to resist? Isn't that what God does even in the early days of Israel and even of Abraham and so forth? Doesn't God tell, for example, in Genesis about the fact that there will be bondage among these people before they are brought out and made a nation? Doesn't he tell the children of Israel when they come into the promised land that they're going to face a lot of idolatrous pressure to conform to idolatry from the nations around them? This is very in character for God, to warn people ahead of time of what's coming. So ultimately, while again, I do believe, and we're going to look at some reasons why, I do believe this book was written several centuries before the Maccabean revolt, it's predicting a lot of the events that are going to culminate in that, because God's saying, listen, just like these people, you too, depending on at what time people were reading the book, you too are going to face some of these things. And it gives a timeline so that when people see where they are in that timeline, they can be prepared to know what's coming and to resist. We might even think of another example, not in the Old Testament this time, but in the New Testament. Remember in Matthew 24, when Jesus is telling his disciples that this catastrophe is coming on Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, the Romans are going to come, all these things. He's foretelling that 40 years before it happens. Why does he warn the disciples that Rome is going to destroy Jerusalem? Any idea? Is he just giving them some fun facts? Oh, hey guys, guess what I learned today? Jerusalem's going to be destroyed in 40 years. Why does Jesus want his disciples to know Jerusalem's going to be destroyed? Okay, good. So that the Christians can know ahead of time, so they can prepare themselves. Prepare themselves for what? Persecution for one thing. What else? What does Jesus tell people to do as they see the signs of these events coming in Matthew 24?
Get up, get out of here.
Get out!
Go get a coat.
Now, what would the Jews be encouraging their Jewish Christian, I say brothers in the sense of ethnicity, what would they be encouraging these people to do? This is your homeland. This is your capital city. Stay and fight. So they would be facing a lot of pressure, wouldn't they? So Jesus, several decades ahead of time, in this case, is warning them, this is what's about to happen. I'm giving you a heads up so you know how to respond. In this case, we have several centuries ahead of time. This is what's going to happen. Here's a timeline of how it's all going to go down. you now know how to respond. Now, it's funny, again, talking about the dating. We're going to talk about this in Daniel 11 in particular. The predictions in Revelation, I keep saying Revelation. In Daniel 11, the predictions in Daniel 11 are so specific. Part of the reason why people argue that Daniel was written around 200, 158 BC is because how could it be so specific if it wasn't written when the events are happening? I mean, I don't know, maybe if God can, know the future, right? It's that specific that no one can conceive without absolute supernatural intervention that anyone could write down something like this and it be this specific unless it was at the time. Otherwise, we're talking about something that is impossibly detailed centuries beforehand. For example, and this is a very moderate example, can you imagine somebody in 1776 predicting the events of this election year? Predicting, for example, that one will rise who has been previously defeated and will be on the cusp of getting the presidency again. I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. And then someone else will come in and will try to run again, but things will get in the way and they will be replaced by their, second in command or whatever. Just kind of even that ambiguous of a description, we would say that people can't do that, right? That somebody invented a time machine in 1776, right? That can't happen. We can't be that specific. Oh, it's even more specific than that when you get to Daniel 11. So the point is, going back to this big picture, the stories, yes, they are wonderful things as standalones. They're encouraging. They're all these things. But they're setting the stage. Daniel, especially this first part, leading into the second part, Daniel is about a man who had to make a choice. Very young man, by the way. Most likely, it's not unlikely that he was a teenager or somewhere in that realm in terms of his age. He was a young man who had to make a choice. And his book was written to people who faced that same choice or who were about to face that same choice down the road. When the culture around me, in this case, a culture that's not even my culture, when culture pressures me to compromise my faith, will I give in? Will I hold firm? Now, you might know something interesting. Isn't that kind of what Revelation's about? Just in a different setting, a different time, with Christianity instead of Judaism, those kind of things? I'm going to let you in. This is kind of an aside, but I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Pretty much any time you have the type of language that's used in books like Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, Revelation, this is essentially the same theme. Apocalyptic literature is what we call it. That's usually why it's used, at least in Scripture. It's usually centered around the same theme. It portrays this grand battle, if you will, between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and asks people who are being pulled by cultural pressure to the forces of evil to recognize, in the big picture, good always wins. That's the pressure Daniel faced. But for subsequent readers, I don't believe that Daniel would have been written right when Daniel lived. It would have been written, probably a few years, maybe a couple decades after Daniel was gone. It's my suspicion. Although it's possible Daniel wrote it. There's debate about that, all right? The bottom line is, this is for future generations. This is for example, the people who come back from captivity as they are facing pressure, once again, to conform. This is about the people when Alexander the Great conquers. Are they going to give into Greek culture or conform? As Greek culture gets stronger, culminating the Maccabean revolt, are they going to compromise or are they going to hold firm? It's using the events of the past to inspire future generations. Isn't that what the whole Bible is? These things that were written aforetime were written for our learning. We have recorded these things as examples for us on whom the ends of the ages have come. That's what the book is. But we have to see it in the big picture. Not just the stories, but also the prophecies, all center on this theme. And once we look at it like that, things are going to start to become a little bit clearer for us, I think. Oops. Oh, I thought I had one more slide. So, we're looking at this idea then, the big picture of Daniel. Am I going to compromise? Am I going to hold firm? Because the stage is being set in those first 6 stories. We're going to look at those stories as stories, right? We're going to try and use them in the way of setting the stage. So next week, we're going to start with Daniel chapter 1. We're going to look at it in story form to get the impact that it's trying to create. We're going to do that throughout the first 6 chapters. Then, hopefully, once we get into the second half of Daniel, we're going to start piecing it together, those prophecies, based on the overall picture that we've been given. We're still going to, this whole time, be referencing back to places like, for example, Revelation, where these things are quoted, time, making the connections, referencing the histories that are being done. In fact, we might take a whole class just to kind of analyze the statute that's given in chapter 2 and what the significance of that is. But I don't want us, even at times when we do look at some more detail, especially in the second half of the book, I don't want us to miss the setting that we're being given, especially by the first half. The beauty of Daniel is it has that first half. You don't really have that in the other books that are written this way, like Ezekiel, Zechariah, Revelation. Daniel gives us so much of a setting and so much explanation of what's happening so that people can understand. And not only understand Daniel, but understand these other books as well. And so we're going to see that as we move through. Any questions or comments as we wrap up for this morning?
I think it was written for three groups of people. The captivity, the remnant that's still and the future. I think all 3 of them directly apply, depending on what side of the desert you're on.
Right. Yes. No, that's very good. Even after the remnant comes back, there are still people that stay back in Babylon. There's still Jews that stay back in Babylon. So even if it's written after the remnant, the first remnant has gone back, you still have those people benefiting from this. So either way, yes, I think that's a good point. Anything else? All right. Thank you all so much.